One of the stories in the Bible that has always kind of puzzled me is the story of Uzzah. You know, the story where Uzzah kind of accidentally touches the ark while carrying it, and then he just dies. Like, why? Like, isn't that a little harsh? Was it really that bad what he did? The story starts in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verses 1 to 4. And King David, he has this idea that they should bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And I think it sounds like a good idea. Why not? It says that the ark was neglected during the reign of Saul, and now they would like to bring it back. And that's wonderful. And David asks the people, like any good leader. And the people think it's a good idea too, and why shouldn't they? So they decide to go and get the ark. And after that, it's like all action. Like in a couple of verses, the whole Israel is suddenly gathered together, and all of a sudden, they are already at the ark at Kiryat Yarim. And then in verse 6, the author suddenly pauses just to say that, by the way, it was the ark of God, the Lord, who is enthroned on the cherubim, and that it's called by his name. Wow. Pretty cool, right? But that's just a side note, and the story goes on. In the next verse, the ark is already on a wagon and they are pulling it and celebrating it, and suddenly they are already reaching the threshing floor. I mean, pretty fast action. They certainly did not waste any time. And then suddenly, in verse 9, the ark shakes. We don't know exactly why. The Hebrew text just says that the oxen were letting loose somehow, and through that we assume that the ark was about to drop. So Uzzah reaches out his hand to touch the ark, to hold it steady, of course. And suddenly, bam, he's dead. I mean, what? He's dead! And it says that the Lord was angry because he had reached to the ark. I mean, why? Why was he angry? What was the problem? I mean, what should have Uzzah done? Just let the ark fall? I mean, it was the ark of God. Wouldn't that have been even worse, just to let it fall? I mean, who wouldn't protect the ark of God if it was about to fall? Was it really that bad? Let's rewind a little. Right in the beginning of the story, in verse 2, David asks the people about their opinion regarding the ark, and he wonders there if it would also be okay with God to bring the ark there. But does he actually ask God? Does somebody in the story actually ask God? I mean, what does God think about this whole thing? We don't know. No one asks him. No one seems to care, or no one has the time. And in verse 3, David says why he wants to bring the ark to Jerusalem. He says, "For we did not turn to it in the days of Saul." Bad days of Saul. But now everything's different, right? David is the king. David reigns now. So David must bring the ark to himself. David is different. Did he stop to think whose ark it actually was? What did it represent? I mean, on it was the presence of God. The author remembers to mention it in verse 6, but David seems so busy to bring the ark to himself, he has no time to think about that. So David wants the ark. But who is actually the one carrying it? In verse 7, it is said that Uzzah and Ahio were pulling the ark. Who are they? No idea. Why were they pulling the ark? I mean, there are a lot of rules connected with the ark. Like, for example, like it said in Numbers 4:15, that only the Kohathites, a special family line inside the Levites, are allowed to carry the holy stuff. Were Uzzah and Ahio Kohathites? We don't know. Apparently that wasn't important enough for them to think about. At least we are not told anything about it. By the way, in verse 7, they put the ark inside a new wagon. What a nice thing to do, right? Well, not really. In Numbers chapter 7, verse 9, it says that the ark should be carried on their shoulders, not in a wagon, on their shoulders. Maybe Uzzah and Ahio didn't know. Maybe the people had already forgotten, but David, he should have known. He was the king. He was the one giving the commands. He should have known. It was part of his duties as a king to know the law. David should have known. And even if Uzzah had known, what should have he done? What could have he done? Tell King David off? I mean, if King David tells you to do something, then you obey. That's what you do. Uzzah was just doing what he was told. But David should have known better. But he didn't. Or he was too busy, or he didn't care, or something. And as a result, Uzzah dies. And in verse 10 it says that David gets angry. David gets angry. What reason has he to get angry? It says in verse 11, he gets angry because the Lord struck Uzzah down. In Hebrew, paras. And then he asks in verse 12, how will I now bring the ark to me? I mean, that was his concern. How will I bring the ark to me? And he decides wisely to leave the ark somewhere else. He leaves it with Obed-Edom. And by the way, we know from chapter 26 that Obed-Edom was a Levite. And that's where David leaves the ark. So maybe he did know where the ark should be and who should take care of it. Because suddenly he starts acting according to the rules. By the way, we find the same story of Uzzah in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And there the same stuff is explained, and the ark stays 3 months with Obed-Edom, and then it is correctly brought back to Jerusalem. But here in Chronicles 13, we have the death of Uzzah. Then we have chapter 14, and only then in chapter 15 the ark is being brought to Jerusalem. Why? What happens in chapter 14? Well, in chapter 14, the Philistines are making war with David and the Israelites, and David, the first thing he does, he goes and asks God, what should we do? And God answers, and they win the war. In verse 11, it says that God struck down the enemy, paras, the same word like it said of Uzzah in chapter 13. But now it is the enemy that is being killed, because David asked God what to do. Why is David able to ask God in chapter 14? Well, because of what had just happened. Apparently, he has learned something. And because of that, thousands of Israelite lives were saved as they defeated the Philistines, because David had learned. I mean, Uzzah's death, it could have been avoided if they had just asked God. But through his death, through chapter 13, David learned, and it saved the lives of thousands of Israelite soldiers. And only after that, in chapter 15, they bring the ark back to Jerusalem, and this time on their shoulders, just like it was supposed to. So I realized this story, it's not so much about Uzzah. It's more about David, and how David learned, and how that affected the lives of thousands and thousands of Israelites. David learned.